Have you ever felt so invisible you could hide in plain sight? That was life for Zacchaeus, the wealthiest, most powerful man in Jericho. To the world, he was a big deal, a ghost whose presence was felt in the crushing weight of taxes and the sprawling luxury of his mansion. But on the inside, he was a man shrinking away, a phantom haunting his own hallways, where the only sound was the echo of his own solitude. The gold that meant joy and security for others was, for him, just the soundtrack to his isolation. He'd count it not out of greed, but out of habit, a hollow ritual to fill the silent hours. Outside the gates of his estate, life was happening, loud and vibrant, like a block party he was never invited to. Inside, every stacked coin was just another stone in the gilded cage he'd built for himself. And then there was his name, a wound that never healed. Zacchaeus. It means the pure one, the righteous. What a cruel joke. A name that should have been a blessing had become a curse, whispered behind his back, a brand marking him as everything he wasn't. He was the sellout, the collaborator, the sinner-in-chief of Jericho. He'd long ago accepted his place in the eyes of his neighbors. And as for God, Zacchaeus figured he had written him off ages ago. It was in the middle of this soul-deep desert that a rumor caught fire in Jericho, a spark that shot right through the walls of his home. A rabbi from Galilee named Jesus was on his way. And this man, they said, was different. He didn't just heal the sick, he broke bread with the outcasts. He touched the untouchables. He looked at tax collectors and sinners and saw something nobody else could. Before we dive deep into this story, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. It's an incredible joy to know these stories can touch hearts in so many different places. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below and let me know you're part of our community. Now, get ready to see the incredible journey of someone who, with raw courage and vulnerability, overcame unimaginable challenges in the middle of his pain. You're going to learn how self-compassion and knowing your own limits can be applied to your life to face down your own moments of crisis and breakthrough. Let's get started. The news that Jesus was passing through his town wasn't just a thought for Zacchaeus, it was an earthquake in his soul. It was a tremor that shook the very foundations of his resignation. Suddenly, an irrational, overwhelming need took over. A hunger to see, to be near, to witness with his own eyes if hope really had a face. He wasn't sure what he was after. It wasn't forgiveness. He felt unforgivable. It wasn't healing. His sickness was his very soul. It was something more primal. It was the chance for a drowning man to glimpse the sky one last time. Just to see the one who, they said, was grace itself in human form. Maybe, just maybe, the light from his eyes could reach him in the darkness. With a resolve he hadn't felt in years, he stood up. The pile of coins on the table lost all its shine, all its power. They were just cold, metal discs. Zacchaeus turned his back on the fortune that shackled him and walked toward the door, not as the chief tax collector, but simply as a man desperate for a sliver of light. Stepping out onto the street, the morning sun felt like a spotlight, exposing every inch of his shame. The crowd, once just background noise, was now a physical, tangible barrier. Conversations died as he approached. Smiles curdled into sneers. The air grew thick, heavy with a judgment he could feel on his skin. The crowd became a living wall of revulsion. People recoiled from him as if he carried the plague, their glares piercing him with hatred. "Traitor!" someone hissed. Another spat on the ground in his path. For a long, painful moment, the instinct to hide, to retreat to the safety of his golden prison, almost won. But the earthquake in his soul was stronger than the wall of men before him. He had to keep going. With every step forward, the wall of contempt closed in. Hands pushed him, shoulders blocked him. His short stature, always a source of insecurity, now became an insurmountable barrier. He stood on his tiptoes, craned his neck, but all he could see was a sea of backs, a forest of cloaks and heads that shut him out completely. The insults were now direct, whispered like venom near his ear. "Crawl back to your hole, you thief. God doesn't listen to your kind." Zacchaeus' power, which could move Roman legions with an order and empty a man's bank account with a signature, was useless here. In fact, it was the very fuel for the hatred surrounding him. He wasn't a citizen of Jericho seeking a prophet. He was the sickness they wanted the prophet to cure them of. Every disgusted look was a confirmation of what his soul already knew. He didn't belong here. Pushed to the edge of the road, crushed against the wall of a pottery shop, despair began to replace hope. The sound of the crowd stirring up ahead told him Jesus was getting closer, but he might as well have been a world away. The spark that had driven him from his house was flickering out, drowned by the tide of rejection. He tasted the bitter ash of defeat, the familiar feeling of being, once again, left out. It was in that moment of near surrender, his head low and his heart heavy, that he looked up, not to the sky, not at the crowd, but to the side. And he saw it. An old, gnarled sycamore fig tree, strong and solid, planted by the road, right in the path where Jesus was headed. Its thick, low branches reached out like open arms, its wide leaves promising a hiding place. A ridiculous, humiliating, and utterly desperate idea bloomed in his mind. An idea that would make the chief tax collector, the man of means, look like a mischievous kid or a raving lunatic. Climb the tree. He, Zacchaeus, a man of his standing, was going to scale a sycamore tree in full view of the entire city that hated him. The image was so absurd he almost laughed at his own misery. For a second, pride fought back. What was left of his worldly dignity screamed against this act of utter self-abasement. It would be better to go home, to the security of his gold and his silence, than to subject himself to such a spectacle. But then he thought of the look in Jesus' eyes, a look he hadn't yet seen, but his soul craved. And he understood. To have a shot at seeing the kingdom of God, he'd have to completely abandon his own kingdom of appearances. Without a second thought, he ran. The act of running was a shock in itself. Men like him didn't run. They walked with measured, authoritative steps. But Zacchaeus ran, his fine robes catching at his feet, his heart pounding in his chest not from fear, but from a strange, dizzying hope. He reached the base of the tree, ignoring the first murmurs of shock that turned into open laughter. The trunk was rough and scraped his soft palms. A low branch tore the hem of his robe. But he didn't stop. With every pull, every strain to climb higher, he felt as if he were shedding not just his expensive clothes, but years of an identity that had suffocated him. The laughter and jeers from the crowd below were real, but they seemed distant, muffled by the sound of his own ragged breath. It's incredible what a person will do when the pain of being invisible becomes greater than the fear of being humiliated, isn't it? If you've ever felt that way, compelled to an act of desperation that was actually an act of faith, type Amen in the comments. Sometimes, our greatest testimony is born in the moment of our greatest vulnerability. Now nestled on a thick branch, partly hidden by the heart-shaped leaves, Zacchaeus finally had a clear view of the road. He was above the crowd that had rejected him. For a moment he felt a sting of triumph. But the feeling quickly vanished, replaced by a crushing wave of doubt. What was he doing up here, perched like a startled bird? Of all the faces in that crowd, of all the righteous and devout, why would the prophet look up? Why would he notice a sinner hiding in a tree? Invisibility, he feared, was his final destination. The air turned electric. Zacchaeus felt the shift before he saw it. The crowd rippled, the voices turning into a reverent hush. Down the dusty road, a figure moved with a calm that seemed to create a pocket of peace in the middle of the chaos. It was him, Jesus. Zacchaeus' heart, which had been galloping with anxiety, now seemed to stop altogether, suspended in time. He wasn't what Zacchaeus had imagined. There was no supernatural glow or crown of light. He was a simple-looking man, with road dust on his feet and a look in his eyes that seemed to hold both the joy of a wedding and the grief of a funeral. He walked, but he didn't seem to be in a hurry. He looked at people, and his gaze didn't just scan over them. It landed. It recognized. Each one. Zacchaeus shrank further into the leaves. Every step Jesus took toward him was a hammer blow to his chest. Hope and fear waged a furious battle inside him. "Look up," a part of his soul pleaded. "Don't you dare," whispered the other, the voice of his shame. "If he looks, he'll see your filth. If he doesn't, it will confirm you're worthless." Then, the longest moment of Zacchaeus' life happened. Jesus was nearing the tree. He smiled at a child who offered him a flower, touched an old man's shoulder, shared a word with one of his disciples. His gaze swept the crowd with love, but never, not for a second, did it lift. He was going to pass right under his branch, continue on his way to Jerusalem, and Zacchaeus would be left behind, a dirty secret hidden in a tree. The confirmation of his invisibility was crushing. It was in that instant of agony that something inside him broke. The fight stopped. The desperate hope and the paralyzing fear dissolved into a strange, quiet surrender. He closed his eyes. It didn't matter anymore. He had tried. He had humbled himself. If this was the end, so be it. In his heart, he let go of the last rope of expectation. For the first time, he asked for nothing, expected nothing. He just was. A sinner in a tree, silent before the silence of God. The sound of footsteps stopped, not gradually, but abruptly. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the crowd. The murmuring, the coughing, the shuffling of feet. It all stopped. Zacchaeus, sensing the change in the atmosphere, opened his eyes. Below him, directly under his branch, the epicenter of that silence was standing still. Jesus had stopped. Zacchaeus held his breath. Why? Why stop there? His mind scrambled for a logical reason. Someone must have asked him a question. One of his followers must have tripped. But no one was moving. All eyes, which had once scorned or ignored him, were now fixed, first on Jesus, and then, slowly, they began to lift in his direction. And then it happened. Slowly, Jesus raised his face. His gaze passed over the curious and confused faces around him, past the lower branches, and climbed, without hesitation, until it met the eyes of Zacchaeus. It wasn't a casual glance or a look of discovery. It was a look of recognition, like someone finding an old friend they'd been expecting to see. And a voice, clear and full of a gentle authority that cut through the world's silence, said his name. Zacchaeus. The sound of his own name, stripped of mockery for the first time in decades, was a physical shock. It hit him harder than any insult. It was his name, the way his mother used to say it, pure, righteous. And the voice continued, "Hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. I must stay. Not, will you invite me, but it is necessary for me to come. Zacchaeus' shame, a fortress built over a lifetime, began to crumble. Jesus hadn't spotted him by chance because of the tree. Jesus already knew him. He wasn't looking for a glimpse. He was being looked for. The invitation wasn't for Zacchaeus to become worthy of receiving him. The invitation was the very source of his new worth. For a moment, Zacchaeus' body wouldn't obey. He just clung to the branch, his brain trying to process the sheer scale of what had just happened. Jesus' voice called to him again, this time with an audible smile in it. "Come on down, Zacchaeus. Joy is waiting for you on the ground." That's what set him free. He scrambled down, clumsy and fast, sliding down the trunk, past caring about dignity or appearances. His sandals hit the dusty ground at the exact moment a new man was born inside of him. He stood before Jesus, breathless, his robes dirty and his hands scratched. But for the first time in his adult life, he felt no shame. He saw in the rabbi's eyes not a judgment of his state, but a profound acceptance that cleansed him more than any temple ritual ever could. He was completely exposed, and completely at peace. That's when the crowd's silence broke, not with applause, but with an ugly, growing murmur. A wave of indignation swept through them like a bitter wind. The words were sharp and clear. "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." The scandal was palpable. The holy man of God, the prophet from Galilee, was about to defile himself by entering the home of Jericho's greatest sellout. Their judgment, which once crushed him, now seemed like distant, irrelevant noise. Zacchaeus barely heard it. His attention was completely captivated by the man in front of him, who didn't flinch at the crowd's disapproval, but instead placed a light hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture that anchored him in his new reality. The people's murmur was the sound of the old world. The presence of Jesus was the foundation of the new one. They began to walk, Jesus and Zacchaeus, side by side, toward the great house on the hill. The crowd parted for them, not out of respect, but with a kind of fascinated horror. It was an unheard-of procession. Grace walking with greed, purity escorting sin. For Zacchaeus, every step was a liberation. The street he had always walked under the weight of hatred, he now walked under the cloak of acceptance. They didn't speak on the way. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of a communication that went beyond words. It was a silence of understanding, of belonging. Zacchaeus felt the warmth of Jesus' presence beside him, a calm, steady strength that seemed to say, "I am here. I see you. You are home." When they reached the great cedar gates, Zacchaeus swung them open. Stepping inside, he saw his house as if for the first time. He saw the cold marble, the expensive tapestries, the gold that glittered everywhere, and he realized it wasn't a home, it was a gilded cage, a mausoleum for a dead soul. But now, life itself was walking through the door. Jesus entered, and with him came a light and a warmth the place had never known. A few of his disciples and a handful of curious onlookers from the crowd followed them in, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and suspicion. Standing before all of them, in the middle of his own grand hall, something inside Zacchaeus overflowed. The grace he had been given couldn't be contained. It demanded a response, an action. True change isn't what we do to get accepted. It's what acceptance inspires us to do. If that truth hits home for you, if you've ever felt a kindness so big it rewired you from the inside out, type "Grace found me" in the comments. It's a way to testify to the power of a love that doesn't demand, but simply gives. Zacchaeus stood before Jesus, his small frame now erect with a new dignity. His voice, once hesitant, rang out clear and strong through the silent hall. "Lord," he cried out, the word both a declaration of faith and a sigh of relief. "Look, half of my possessions I am giving to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." It wasn't a bargain. It was a shout of freedom, the sound of golden chains shattering for good. A shocked silence fell over the hall. The disciples looked from Zacchaeus to Jesus, their faces a mix of astonishment and disbelief. The others, the Pharisees and curious townsfolk who had slipped inside, were slack-jawed. That declaration was more radical than any sermon they had ever heard. It wasn't a vague promise, it was numbers, half of everything, and a 4-fold restitution, the maximum penalty the law of Moses required for deliberate theft, a judgment Zacchaeus was placing on himself. The man who was the very personification of greed in Jericho was, in a single breath, dismantling his fortune. It was an act so contrary to his nature, it seemed like a miracle in itself, perhaps even greater than healing a blind man. They were witnessing the resurrection of a soul, and the spectacle left them speechless. The power of this encounter was undeniable, and the proof was standing right there, a small man made giant by his generosity. Jesus showed no surprise. He just watched Zacchaeus with a look of deep affection, like a father seeing his child finally find the way home. Then he turned to the silent crowd, and his voice resonated, not with triumph, but with a calm, profound joy. "Today," he said, stressing the word, "salvation has come to this house." The declaration hung in the air, thick with meaning. Salvation, right here, in this sinner's house, at this very moment. And Jesus continued, looking directly at those who had been murmuring, at those who still saw Zacchaeus as a traitor. "For this man, too, is a son of Abraham." With that one sentence, Jesus didn't just forgive Zacchaeus, he restored his identity, his heritage, his place among God's people. He told the world that the man they had cast out belonged to God all along. And so there would be no doubt about the purpose of this day, of this scandalous meal, of this grace that seemed to defy all logic. Jesus concluded, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." In that instant, Zacchaeus understood. He hadn't been an obstacle on Jesus' road to Jerusalem, he was the destination. His lost soul was the very treasure the Master had come to Jericho to find. After those words, the tension broke. Servants, still stunned, brought out bread, wine, fruit, and cheese, and they sat down to eat. The simplest act, and in that moment, the most sacred. Eating together. In their culture, sharing a meal was sharing a life, a sign of peace, family, and unconditional acceptance. The house, once a mausoleum of oppressive silence, was now full. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation replaced the cold echo of gold coins. Zacchaeus, the host, moved among his guests, serving the bread, pouring the wine, his face lit up with a joy he had never known. Every act of service was a part of his new freedom. He would look over at Jesus sitting at his table, and a sense of awe would wash over him. There was no more shame, no more fear, no more need to hide. There was only an overwhelming gratitude. He didn't fully understand the theology behind it all, but he understood the feeling of being found, of being made clean. His name, Zacchaeus, for the first time, sounded like the truth in his own ears. He knew a long journey lay ahead. Making restitution wouldn't just be an act of wiring money. It would be a process of going to every person he had hurt, looking them in the eye, and asking for their forgiveness. It would be hard, humiliating, and painful. But for the first time, he didn't see this task as a punishment. He saw it as a privilege. The chance to actively repair the wrong he had done, and to live out his redemption. Jesus would eventually leave, continuing his inexorable journey to the cross in Jerusalem, but he would leave behind far more than the memory of a meal. He would leave a transformed man, a house filled with light, and a story that would echo through Jericho for generations. The story of how grace doesn't wait for us to climb to heaven, but comes down to find us, even when we're hiding on the highest branch of our own shame. When the meal ended, a comfortable quiet settled in. Jesus stood to leave. There was no long, drawn-out goodbye, no list of instructions. He simply looked at Zacchaeus, and in that look was everything: the commission, the trust, the blessing. Zacchaeus didn't feel abandoned as he watched Jesus and his disciples walk out his door. On the contrary, he felt fully equipped. The Master's presence hadn't left. It had just moved inside of him. The next morning, for the first time in 20 years, Zacchaeus didn't go to the tax office. He sat at the same table where he used to count his coins with an empty heart, but now his task was the opposite. With a ledger before him, he began the work of dismantling his empire of greed. He wasn't calculating profits. He was calculating debts. Debts of honor. Next to each name, he wrote down a figure 4 times as large. His first act wasn't to send a servant. He went himself. He walked to the poorest part of Jericho, a place he had always avoided. He found the home of an old potter, whose small business he had squeezed with merciless taxes a year before. The old man, seeing Zacchaeus at his door, shrank back in fear, expecting another demand, another humiliation. Zacchaeus said nothing. He just held out a heavy bag of coins. The potter looked from the bag to Zacchaeus' face, confused. "This is yours," Zacchaeus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I cheated you. This is 4 times what I took. I ask for your forgiveness." The tears that welled up in the old potter's eyes were worth more to Zacchaeus than all the gold he had ever owned. News of that act spread through Jericho faster than any gossip. People couldn't believe it. They scoffed, at first, said it was a trick. But then, a widow received her payment. A shepherd. A small business owner. One by one, Zacchaeus went about untying the knots of injustice he had bound all over the city. The scorn turned to amazement, and amazement to a quiet, awestruck respect. Zacchaeus' house, once a fortress of isolation, had its doors thrown open. Where there was once the silence of loneliness, there was now the sound of people being helped, debts being forgiven, food being shared with the hungry. The man who had hidden from the people became the heart of his community. He was no longer Zacchaeus the taxman. He was Zacchaeus the righteous. The name finally fit. In the quiet evenings, he no longer counted coins to keep the emptiness at bay. Instead, he would sit in his courtyard, look up at the stars, and feel a peace he never knew was possible. The wealth he had left felt light, a tool to be used, not a burden to be guarded. He discovered that true wealth wasn't in having, but in giving. His value didn't come from what people said about him, but from the gaze of a single man who saw him hiding in a tree. There comes a moment in our lives when being found by grace sets us free to live no longer for ourselves but for others. That's the point where redemption gets real. If the journey of Zacchaeus has inspired you, if you believe in the life-changing power of a divine encounter, share this story. Carry the message forward that it is never too late to come down from the tree and open the door to your home. The legacy of Zacchaeus wasn't the gold he amassed, but the grace he gave away. His story became a living legend in Jericho, a permanent testament that no one is so lost they cannot be found. He became living proof that salvation isn't a reward for the good, but a rescue for the lost, offered freely to anyone who, even with a heart full of shame, dares to look up. And so, the man who climbed a tree just to glimpse hope, came down from it to become a beacon of that same hope to everyone around him. He learned the deepest lesson of all: God doesn't love us because we are valuable. We are valuable because He loves us first. And that love, once truly received, has the power to change absolutely everything.